What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the albums of Misery Index. Alright, so the audience expectation around this was pretty clear. I wasn't sure if I was going to do it, but the demand is high. So I'm going to go ahead and start right from the beginning with Retaliate in 2003. So these guys start off super brutal. Like, I had not backtracked to some of their earlier material until now, but this is just really bloody, intense kind of stuff. Really raw production, lots of blast beats, just straight for the throat, no frills, just pure aggression, and with some of their hardcore influences showing from the very beginning. Like, parts of this album actually remind me of listening to, like, 90s metalcore, and also, of course, like grindcore albums, especially like the D-beat sections on The Great Depression or the gang vocals on Demand the Impossible. Nothing mind-blowing here, but at just over 30 minutes, there's very little fat on the bone, and the drumming is just pulverizing, which is something that the commenters said when I put up the poll, is this guy absolutely kills it. Yeah, I was pretty impressed with this thing, and given my nostalgia for this style of production, I kind of got into it. I really did. Definitely fun, just like breaks your bones, smashes your skull, good time. So I'd say if I were doing like a standalone review on it, it's probably more of like in the B range, but for Misery Index and for a debut especially, I'm going to go ahead and put it at A tier. Alright, next up we have Discordia in 2006, and this is very much keeping that same sound for another very concise runtime, and I gotta say again, like as my regular viewers know, I really appreciate a band that understands that an album only needs to be as long as it needs to be. There are just way too many bands with these like nearly hour or sometimes over an hour runtime that just, it doesn't need to be, especially in this style. Like 30 minutes is plenty. Like 35 to 40 minutes I generally find to be the sweet spot for this kind of stuff. You get in, you get out, you make it happen, you leave the people wanting more, as opposed to having a bunch of filler, getting really bloated and tiresome, and the tracks start to run together. We'll be talking about that a little bit with some of these later albums, but for this one, not the case. Like, just keeping that breakneck speed, and seriously, again, some of the drumming is just absolutely inhuman. Like, the bass kick and the snare hits, the speed of them, just the pure octane is insanity. I am a little at a loss here because these albums are just so similar. I mostly have like the exact same things to say about them, but I do think that I enjoy the debut quite a bit more because I just find those songs to be a little bit better overall. They're stronger, they stick with me more. These ones a little bit more forgettable, so I am going to put this one at C tier. Next up is fan favorite Traitors in 2008, and this one is produced by legendary producer and Converge guitarist Kurt Ballou. Big fan of his work, both with his band and pretty much like all the albums that he's been attached to. Like, he had a hand in this Skeleton Witch album back here, which also sounds fantastic. Still raw and gritty, but with a bit more low end and groove, and also adding a little bit more depth to the death growls, which I really like. Like, I like some variety in the vocals, and that definitely comes into play a bit more with this album. Getting a little deathier, but not losing those other influences in the process. We Never Come in Peace has a great hook reminiscent of Dying Fetus to kick this things off. Just reminds me of queuing up Destroy the Opposition. The interplay of the drums and guitar on Theocracy is nothing short of catastrophic. Like, lots of just like back and forth between those guys. I also love the chanting of Traitors at the end of the title track after the instruments fade out. Showing some more dynamic songwriting too on tracks like Ghosts of Catalonia and the doomy Thrown into the Sun. Just a powder keg of pure death metal violence, but again with those hardcore and grindcore influences. Definitely, again, a fan favorite, and it's clear why. All of their best qualities, I'd say, are on display here, and for some of their best songs to date, easily. I also feel like the band Vitriol owe a lot of their sound to this album. I'm going to go ahead and put it at S tier. Then they followed that up with Heirs to Thievery in 2010. This is the final album with lead guitarist Sparky Voiles. And speaking of Dying Fetus, John Gallagher actually guests on Sleeping Giants. And there are a lot of guest spots on here, including Eric Rutan, Mo Alvarado, Rich Johnson, and Vince Matthews. Also continuing the trajectory of a more groove-focused direction with some serious head bobbers like the Carrion Call and the Spectator. Those definitely got my motor running in the best way, but then also still bringing blast beat grinders like Heirs to Thievery and the Illuminaut. I'd also say Plague of Objects is a standout on the faster side of things with more insane drumming. Like, that track just absolutely kills it. This is another very popular album among the fans. It's actually the top rated on Metal Storm out of their discography. Very good stuff. Had a great time listening to this one. Looking forward to going back to it some more. It's also at S tier. Then in 2014, we got The Killing Gods. So the album opener here is definitely a shift with its more melodic touches, which is a fair introduction to the style of this one. Feels like it's folding together the sound of those last two albums with a few tips from bands like The Black Dahlia Murder and Aborted. Definitely a lot more atmosphere and epic soloing on tracks like The Harrowing and Gallows Humor. Then you've got the monks in the intro to the title track, which is kind of a nice little touch. I remember when this album came out and all of my reviewer friends seemed to be talking about it, and I just didn't understand the hype. Like, I would sit down, I play it, I listen to it a couple of times, and I'm like, I don't get it. It all kind of runs together. But I will say, listening to it again now, I appreciate it a lot more. But I do think that the move to, again, talking about runtime here, over 40 minutes is counterproductive for their style. Like, they have a very brutish, fairly simplistic, not to say that it's like simple to play, but the structures of the songs are very sort of like basic. There's not a ton in there, and that's fine. Like, I love punk rock and stuff that like just thrives on that style, but short is better generally for that stuff. And even though like this is around like 43 minutes, that's still not like over the top. It does feel like it drags in places. There are some sections that feel like they're a little bit more fillery, and then the constant hardcore barking in particular gets a little old. I miss having a bit more variety in the vocals. You don't really get those deeper, deathier parts. Colony Collapse has some nice raspier snarls on it, and I think we could have used a lot more of that. I think that would have gone a long way in and of itself. And I will say the Ministry cover on the deluxe edition is pretty fun. So I'm going to give this one a B tier. All right, and then Rituals of Power in 2019, another big atmospheric intro to this one with Universal Untruths. I feel like it's going for this big, grand, imposing sound, but I actually find it to be kind of generic and dull, which is kind of the interesting point. It's like they're bringing in these more melodic influences, which you think would make the tracks more interesting, and sometimes they do, but I think a lot of the time it actually makes it feel more generic. And also this intro, I don't think really matches the rest of the album either, which is ultimately more of the same. The Choir Invisible is a pretty solid track with a mix of thrashy riffs with more hardcore inspired ones, complete with gang vocals. New Salem and Rituals of Power are also great for headbanging. They've scaled the runtime back to 36 minutes with this one, but still I have some of the same criticism in that I don't find the songwriting to be all that impressive, and I think it like barely even carries that. It's enjoyable. Like, there's not a lot on this album that I'm just like, I don't like it. It's just mostly I'm kind of like, I'd rather be listening to Traitors. I'd rather be listening to some of that earlier stuff. And also, like, very heavy. There's no question there. If you just want pure heavy, just brain dead, bashing skull kind of music, then you can't really go wrong here. But I would say there are just so many other also heavy albums that have more substance than this, personally. Just my take. As always, this is all totally subjective, but let me know down in the comments like if you disagree with that and why. So, album, still enjoyable, worth a listen for sure. I'm going to put it at B tier. And that brings us to Complete Control in 2022. So this is the first album for the Baltimore band with Century Media Records. Administer the Dagger starts off on a very sludgy note with big, plotting, atmospheric guitars and more of a shouted delivery before going all Lamb of God with a raging groove metal riff. I do feel like a lot of these songs do a good job, and probably a better job than those last two, of kind of mixing styles. The Eaters and the Eaten has another meaty, groovy tremolo hook to get the head bobbing to the mid-pace beat. I love when they throw in the second guitar too to harmonize with that, and also this goes through a number of sudden pace changes to keep you on your toes, and a pretty wicked guitar solo towards the end as well. And that's just another thing too, that like no matter the quality of the albums, like the drumming is always on point. Once again, you can hear the hardcore and grindcore influences coming through on a number of tracks, the latter more so on Necessary Suffering, and especially the almost napalm death sounding intro of Rites of Cruelty, and then the former on the Hatebreed worthy Infiltrators and crossover rager Reciprocal Repulsion. Gotta love that clunky punk rock bass on that last one too. I would say each of these songs feels like they have a little bit more of a distinct personality to differentiate them within the album, and it feels a bit more in line with Traitors and Heirs to Thievery, but with those melodic elements more effectively woven into that fabric. Especially Conspiracy of None, which somehow pulls off tough guy hardcore and some of that big blackened like Hath sound within the same composition. Thanks also in part I would say to Will Putney for the excellent mix. I still have some issues with their music not always being the most memorable again when compared to other bands, but this album does a good job of keeping me more engaged than the last two with its pretty consistent track listing. Tight, energetic, to the point. I'm going to put this one at A tier. Y'all check out this playlist for plenty more metal tier lists, and stay tuned for my decapitated tier list real soon. Let me know down in the comments what is your favorite Misery Index album and why, but that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.